Hello, let's talk about writing assignment number 2. I'm going to go through the different steps for completing this assignment. The topic of writing is the difference between implicit and explicit memory. Here are some topics you can write about. How do these memory systems differ from each other? How do researchers separate them in laboratory research? Once you know how researchers measure them and test them, you have a good understanding of implicit memory versus explicit memory. What kind of task or measurements will be valid measures of implicit versus explicit memory? The explicit memory is more intuitive. We know about it in everyday life, and the psychology has been studying explicit memory for a long time. Implicit memory, research on implicit memory is relatively more recent. Do implicit and explicit memory systems have different effects? How do researchers demonstrate those effects? What are the real-life applications of the differences between implicit and explicit memory systems? These are the topics you can write about, but you don't have to write about all these topics. You are going to do a literature review and find 2 research articles relevant to these topics. So the 2 articles will not be able to cover all of these issues. You can focus on one of the issues or 2 of the issues. There are 4 steps to complete this writing project. First, you need to find the articles, find 2 research papers relevant to this topic. We want research report where the authors report actual study they have conducted. You want the papers to include research methods. The research methods will tell you how they measured implicit and or explicit memory. And you want them to report our statistical analysis results. The basic results will tell you what their findings are. I have some samples. I have some sample papers for you. You can use these samples. This sample paper we went through in class. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more in a while. But let me show you how to do a literature review and search for articles. Let's see. A quick and dirty way to do a literature review will be to Google it. So in Google, you can search for implicit memory research. We tried Google, it doesn't give us a whole lot of focused information. It gives us a lot of information from all sources, like not only scientific research. So probably we want to use something more sophisticated. Let's use a library. Let's use a library database. Carolina University has a good library database, and let's try one of them. You have to log in. You have to log in, of course, to access this database. In psychology, we usually use PsychInfo. Let's see here. PsychArticle is also a very good database. It gives you full articles. If you search under PsychArticle, it will list all the resources in psychology that has full articles, full text available. But I would use PsychInfo. PsychInfo also gives you articles that you don't have access to the full text. You have access to the title and abstract. That's okay. I find that for some articles that you don't have access to the full text from the PsychInfo, usually you can find it from elsewhere. You can find the full text from elsewhere. For example, some of the authors would share their full text articles in their personal website. It's available. And also if you really want to have the full text and you cannot find it anywhere on the internet, you can email the author. The author might be able to send you a copy. So PsychInfo is a good one. Let's see, I want to search under some keyword. Of course, an obvious keyword is implicit memory. That's one. And I would also include explicit memory. Maybe another one, research. Let's try research. I could use experimental research that will give me a more specific resources, or I could include like a clinical research. This will give me only the resources relevant to a clinical psychology, but I don't want to be too limited. I might want to start with a casting a big net, see what shows up. Here are the results. Yeah, there are a lot of articles on implicit memory and explicit memory. You have pages and pages. And now it's time to make selections. For a first-year psychology product, one good criteria for selection that you want to look at the relevance. Do they tell you something about implicit memory or explicit memory? Are these articles relevant, and do they answer your questions? And also, is it accessible? Is it understandable? Is this something that you can understand with your current knowledge and talk about it? I will browse through all these articles. I'll start with the title. So let's start with the title. Position, item association play a role in acquisition order, knowledge in implicit serial reaction task. Yeah, this one might be too new for me. Too many terminologies, too many technical terminologies. I want to find something that is accessible, that demonstrates implicit memory and explicit memory in a clear and simple way. Explicit and implicit memory in older adults, neuropsychological correlates. No, it doesn't have me that much. Also, this one doesn't have a full text. This is dissertation. Dissertation thesis, usually it's very long. It's a long article, dozens and dozens, maybe more than 100 pages. So that's not a good choice. It's too, takes a long time to read through. Stratification of memory retrieval processes on perceptual tasks. This kind of titles tells you that it's a very deep study. It's a very complex study. It's not only on implicit memory or explicit memory. It studies many factors other than memory. For example, perception. It's not a good choice. Cognitive bias in panic disorder as measured by information processing tasks. Yeah, so not really, it's not catching my eyes. Cross-sectional study memory development in children. It doesn't have the keyword of implicit, explicit memory. Yeah, this one sounds good. Number 9, aging predicts a decline in explicit and implicit memory. It has an implicit explicit memory, and it is a lifespan study, might be potentially interesting, but I'm not ready to settle down, not ready to settle down yet. I want to look more and find the ones that I really like, that I'm sure that I can understand this. And this tells me specifically and concretely about implicit versus explicit memory. Sex does not sell effective sexual advertising parameters on women's of implicit and explicit recall of ads and brands. Yeah, sounds interesting, but let's look some more articles. Explicit but not implicit memory predicts ultimate attainment in the native language. It's implicit and explicit memory in language learning. Sponsorship information, reception and processing explicit and implicit memory of in-game advertising. This is about computer games, about using commercials or playing commercials to people who are playing computer games, and they study explicit and implicit memory. Seems to be a lot of applied research about implicit and explicit memory. Perceptual priming can increase or decrease with aging. That's about aging. Yeah, quite some research about implicit and explicit memory in the context of aging. Seems that people of different ages have different capacities in implicit versus explicit memory. Priming effect in children with type 1 diabetes. Priming is part of implicit memory research. Explicit and implicit memory during sleep. That sounds really interesting. When you're sleeping, does memory still work? Let's look at this one. So you eyeball this one. Let's see, read the abstract. The purpose of this study was to indicate the changes in implicit and explicit memory under wake and sleep conditions by using a battery that can measure different subsections of memory. Yeah, they have measurements. They have measured different types of memory. 24 healthy individuals participated in this study. Modified versions of auditory verbal learning test and modified word stem completion test were applied to study and control groups with a scope of modified multiple block design. I like the tests. They have two tests. Modified versions of auditory verbal learning test. Verbal learning, you are trying to learn new words. And that might be a test of explicit memory. Modified word stem completion test. This might be the implicit memory measurement. This might be useful. However, they used modified multiple block design. That might be a technical hurdle. That might be a technical hurdle in research design. And I have some reservations about this one. It's worth looking at, but I'm going to look on for something with a more straightforward methodology. The revised hierarchical model, explicit and implicit memory. This seems to be a book. Yeah, a book is too long. I don't want to read a book. tracking explicit and implicit long-lasting traces of fearful memory in humans. Yeah, this sounds to be really interesting. They are studying fearful memories, and it could be explicit or implicit. Potentially interesting. Let's move on, but positive effects in explicit and implicit emotional memory. Again, sounds interesting. Age effects on explicit and implicit memory. This sounds really interesting. And it's open access. You can have the full article. That might be really worth looking into. Let's look at the abstract. It is well documented that explicit memory, for example, recognition declines with age. In contrast, many argue that implicit memory, such as priming, is preserved in healthy aging. For example, priming tasks such as perceptual identification is often not statistically different in groups of young and older adults. Such observations are commonly taken as evidence for distinct explicit and implicit learning memory systems. In this article, we discover several lines of evidence that challenge this view. We describe how patterns of differential age-related decline may arise from differences in the way in which the two forms of memory are commonly measured. We review recent research suggesting that under improved measurement methods, implicit memory is not age invariant. Sounds good, but this is research. Review articles. They're not going to report a particular study. They're going to review a lot of different research projects. That's not what I'm looking for. Sometimes when you're doing a literature review, there's a little bit of trial and error involved. Explicit and implicit memory, that's a book. No, not this one. Implicit and explicit memory outcomes in children who have sustained severe traumatic brain injury. Preliminary finding. This sounds promising, sounds very promising. We know that brain injury sometimes damage one memory system, but not other memory systems, depending where the injury occurs. Could be a caper. Students' long-term memories from an ecology field excursion, retelling a narrative as an interplay between implicit and explicit memory. No. Implicit and explicit olfactory memory in people with and without Down syndrome. Yeah, people with and without Down syndrome, it's olfactory memory. Focus on olfactory memory. Maybe not. A double dissociation of implicit and explicit memory in young and older adults. Sounds really interesting. Sounds really interesting. You browse the title and you look into the ones that you are really found interesting. And there's also a lot of research about implicit memory and depression, anxiety. Those might be worth looking into if you're interested in depression, anxiety, and how memories influence those conditions. Implicit and explicit memory performance in children with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. That sounds interesting. The title sounds interesting. Let's look at the abstract. The present investigation examined implicit and explicit memory in 20 children diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, and 20 matched controls. So they studied altogether 40 people. 20 of these people have ADHD and 20 don't have ADHD. Consistent with previous research, children with ADHD performed more poorly than controls on an explicit test of long-term memory for pictures. ADHD kids do more poorly on the explicit memory test. New results were that there was no deficit on an implicit memory test for equivalent materials, and then the observed deficit in explicit memory operated on over and above the effects of depression and anxiety. So they do find something really interesting. The kids with ADHD, they don't have a deficit in implicit memory, but they do have a deficit on explicit memory. And those are the different impacts of implicit memory and explicit memory. And then they show that this might be two systems, two memory systems. Another finding to emerge was that ADHD children had greater difficulty than controls in identifying pictures of objects that were presented in unusual form. So what does that mean? Unusual form, either rotated or degraded. Yeah, is that part of an implicit memory? Overall, the pattern results is interpreted in terms of deficient effort for resource-intensive processes in ADHD, but intact automatic processes. Research shows that the implicit memory is largely automatic, but the explicit memory is effortful. When we were studying the memory chapter, we talked about effortful processing versus automatic processing. Sounds to be really interesting. And the good thing that they have the full article. Let's try the full article. Let's look at the full article. This article seems to be quite useful. It tells you about how they measured implicit and explicit memory. And they are trying to differentiate implicit memory from explicit memory. See if you can enlarge it. The next step that you want to look at the full article and see if you can understand the methodology and the results. Yeah, we already read an abstract. Let's look at the full article. According to the predominant perspective in psychiatry, attention deficit hyperactivity kids involve problems of inattention, poor concentration, and disorganization, and excessive motoric activity or behavior impulsivity. Yeah, you can also look at the way they cite other people's articles. It is one of the most common psychiatric disorders of childhood. Yeah, so this basically you have an overview of ADHD. And then the article also talk about the cognitive deficit of this problem. Now they talk about implicit and explicit memory. This is the useful part. The study of memory performance described so far all involve tests of explicit memory. Schechter described explicit memory as that form of memory that is revealed when performance on the task requires conscious collection of previous experience. Yeah, this is definition explicit memory. It's very compatible with the textbook. We get the same information from the textbook. They give a definition of implicit memory and explicit memory. Implicit memory, where previous experiences facilitate performance on a task that does not require conscious or intentional recollection of those experiences. Yeah, so that's a definition. And it's the same as the one we got from the textbook. So we are looking in the right direction. We're looking at the right information. Now, I'm pretty sure that this part is easily accessible, easily understandable. They talk about effortful processes and automatic processes corresponding to implicit and explicit memory. And then let's look at the present, what they did. The present study set out to examine the implicit memory in ADHD children and compare it with explicit memory performance. That's good. So they are comparing implicit and explicit memory. Importantly, the implicit and explicit tasks were carefully matched in all aspects except the nature of the retrieval phase. So they match the task for implicit and explicit memory to compare them in a very controlled way. In each case, carefully matched, the study phase presented pictures of common objects. In the implicit condition, the task phase then involved naming the same objects in degraded form. Now, the procedure has two phases, the study phase and the recall phase, or the retrieval phase, or the testing phase. You ask people to look at some images and then ask them to recognize it. You test their memory. So how do you test implicit memory versus explicit memory? In the explicit condition, the stimuli had to be the same format as for the implicit test. That means that in the explicit test and implicit test, you use the same pictures. They use the same pictures for implicit and explicit test, but they differed in the instructions. attempt to require participants to name the object only if it was explicit, remembered from the study phase. This close matching of the task ensured that any lack of effect ADHD on implicit memory in the context of expected deficiency in explicit memory could be attributed to only explicit implicit retrieval difference. They really want to show a particular deficit in explicit memory. The second important aspect of design was that the possible effects of mood disturbances, namely anxiety and depression, on explicit memory performance were considered. Yeah, this is another issue they are investigating. They are investigating anxiety and depression, how these conditions affect memory, particularly on explicit memory. This part is not my main concern. This issue, my main interest is on the difference between implicit memory and explicit memory. So I'm going to not going to focus on this topic. Now, the introduction or the overview of research of this particular research is pretty understandable. They are trying to show that ADHD kids suffer from deficit on explicit memory, but not on implicit memory. Implicit memory is okay. Automatic processing is no different between ADHD children and control children. Let's look at the methodology. Participants. This part usually is easy to understand. You describe the subjects. They have ADHD kids and non-ADHD kids. Some of the kids have anxiety and depression problems. Some of them don't. This part should be understandable. And then let's look at research design. In this study, 3 variables were manipulated. We learned this word from the research methodology chapter. Group membership, ADHD versus control as a paired variable. So one variable was some kids have ADHD, some kids are control or they don't have ADHD. And also type of a memory task, that's my focus. They have 2 types of memory tasks. One is explicit and the other one is implicit, which was varied within subjects. Yeah, subjects did 2 tasks. Priming condition, started versus unstarted, which was also varied within the subjects. I need to look into the details here, but so far so good. All participants completed the implicit memory task first to reduce the likelihood that the children would apply deliberate rather than automatic recall strategies, as might be the case if it had been preceded by the implicit task. They have a reason to ask people to do the implicit task first. If people did the explicit task first, that would influence on their implicit performance. For both memory tasks, pictures rather than words were used as stimuli. They asked the kids to view pictures and try to remember pictures. They tested their memories on pictures. Given that ADHD can impact negatively on school learning and hinder the development of reading skills, yeah, they used the pictures rather than words in order to avoid the influence of academic or reading ability, basically. The two groups will differ on reading abilities. The study phase for both tasks was to name pictures and objects and indicate whether they're upright or down. That's understandable. You name the picture. What is it? Is it a doggy or a house? Is it upside down, right, upright, or upside down? A task, the implicit task was to name degraded pictures. So you would degrade the picture. It's unclear, and you have to name it. That is an implicit task. Priming was calculated at the proportion of studied pictures correctly named. A task minus the baseline identification of unstudied pictures. The tested priming effects basically is the percentage of pictures you name correctly. You name correctly above and beyond the baseline. For the explicit task, the task was to say whether pictures were old or new. Is that a new picture or old picture? Yeah, that is basically recognition. It's a recognition task of your explicit memory. Recognition accuracy was measured in terms of hits, the number of old pictures correctly recognized as having been presented to the study, and false alarms. False alarms would be the new pictures incorrectly recognized as the old ones. Yeah, from this description, it seems that they do have different measures for implicit memory versus explicit memory. And the description is quite clear. And then you read the materials. The materials are the pictures. These pictures are carefully selected. You can look at the details. It should be really easy to understand. The procedure, that is the gist of the research methodology. The children in the clinical group were tested first, where controls were tested after matching them to ADHD participants. Yeah, so you test the ADHD kids first, and then you test the non-ADHD kids. All participants were tested individually over 2 half-hour sessions. You describe how they get tested, the environment, the testing conditions, and then let's look at the study phase. What happens in the study phase? Participants were instructed to try to remember each picture and its respective background color, could be yellow or purple. On each study trial, fixation point was presented for a brief period of time, followed by 2 seconds presentation of the picture, the target picture. The children were required to name the picture aloud, then nominate whether it was presented upright or upside down. What is it? Doggy. It's upright or it's upside down. If unsure as to the orientation or identity of the item, participants were instructed to guess. If you don't know, just guess. There were 3 practice trials before 40 experimental trials. There are 40 experimental trials. That was the study phase. And then in the distractor phase, participants performed a 15 minutes distractor task that consisted of the vocabulary or block design. Yeah, this part of IQ test, we talk about IQ test, right? In the class. That's a distractor. It's basically a filler task. And then you have the test phase. Now the subject get tested on their implicit memory and explicit memory. In this part, you will focus on what are the differences in the testing of implicit versus explicit memory. Following the distractor task, participants perform the task phase where pictures were all presented in degraded form. Do they have samples? Let's see what do those degraded pictures like? So I'm going to scroll down to look at it. They don't have samples. Degrading means the pictures are blurred, not really sharp, unclear. Participants perform the task phase where these pictures were included some of the old pictures, some of the new pictures, all presented in degraded phase. On each task trial, a fixation point was presented briefly, and then you show the picture, you see the picture. The picture was really brief, only about a quarter of a second. 1000 milliseconds is 1 second. 250 milliseconds is 1/4 of a second. Here are the details, really critical. For the implicit memory task, participants were required to name each picture as quickly as possible. Name the picture with the first name that came to mind. You have to be really fast. What is it? Doggy, rabbit, table, chair. They were told that they might not be able to identify all the pictures and to guess when uncertain. If you are unsure, just guess. That was implicit task. For the explicit memory task, participants were instructed to declare whether they had seen the picture previously during the study phase or not. Label it either as old or new. So is it old or new? This is an explicit measure in that it requires you to recognize a picture. Have you seen this in the previous phase? Have you seen these objects a few minutes earlier? Where the child labeled the picture as old, they were also required to name the picture and then nominate the color background. They also reported the color background. For both explicit and implicit memory tasks, there were 3 practice trials before 40 experimental trials. Now they have a clear description of implicit memory versus explicit memory measures. For the explicit memory, it's recognition. Is it old or new? For the implicit memory, it's basically name the object as fast as possible and as accurately as possible. Look at the result. Study phase performance. Study phase. So this was when the kids were starting or learning about the objects. We can read through that, but that's not the focus. We're really interested in explicit memory versus implicit memory. When the old new recognition task is used to assess explicit memory, 2 aspects performance are of interest. Number 1, the hit rate. Hit rate, that's the accuracy of hit, which refers to the percentage of old studied items correctly identified as old. The false alarm refers to the percentage of unstudied or new items incorrectly identified as old. The hit and false alarm rates represent the primary measure of explicit memory performance in this study. That's how they measure explicit memory. It's recognition, correctly recognizing old objects as old and rejecting new objects. They are not old. I've never seen this before. In terms of hit rate, ADHD group performance worse. It's significantly worse than the control group. Here, the p-value, they did a t-test. We don't have to worry about the t-test, but we see the p-value is highly significant, indicating a deficit in explicit memory recognition. There was no difference between the two groups in terms of false alarms. Seems that the two groups don't differ in false alarms, indicating no difference on false alarms. Yeah, we can ignore the details and focus on the gist. Recall of color in which old atoms were originally presented was recorded a secondary measure of explicit memory. So they have a second measure of explicit memory. Recall the color in which the old atom were originally presented. This measure was calculated percentage of old atoms identified as old and named correctly, and for which study phase color was remembered. Yeah, they tried well. They asked people to remember the color it was presented before. The two groups did not differ. The two groups on the color recall test did not differ significantly. This was, their explanation was that in both groups, the performance was poor. In both normal people, normal kids and ADHD kids, their recall of the color were really a chance level. They were guessing, basically. Not an interesting result. Now they have a good explanation of explicit memory. Now let's look at implicit memory. The percent of degraded pictures named correctly in the studied and unstudied conditions were calculated, and they are shown in table 5. Priming scores, look at priming scores. Priming scores were used to measure implicit memory performance. So their measure of implicit memory is a priming score. What is a priming score? You have an absolute priming score for each subject, and that's a percentage of studied items named correctly minus the percentage of unstudied items named incorrectly. Suppose you have 10 items, you name them. Maybe you got 80% right, 80% right. And then you got 20% incorrect. On the unstudied items, the difference, while your absolute priming score is 80% minus 20%. In terms of absolute priming, there was no significant difference between ADHD and control groups. So absolute priming doesn't differ, indicating no deficit in implicit memory for ADHD children. ADHD group showed a marginally more priming than the control group. ADHD kids showed much more stronger priming. Table 5 is the result. Implicit task phase percentage studied and unstudied items identified correctly, and absolute relative priming. So this is hit rate, study items identified correctly. These two groups do not differ that much. Unstudied group correctly seems the ADHD kids are a little bit lower here. Absolute priming, that is a major measurement of implicit memory. Seems ADHD group a little bit better than the control group, but it's non-significant. The group is the difference is not significant, not big enough to reach statistical significance. For the relative priming measure, the ADHD group also seems to be better than the control group, but still is not big enough to reach statistical difference. The table is very good, it tells you the mean and the standard deviation. In the parentheses, you have the standard deviation. Let's read more about the results. We were reading about absolute priming. Absolute priming, there was no significant difference between ADHD kids and control groups, indicating no deficit in implicit memory for ADHD children. In fact, the ADHD group showed marginally more priming than the control group. Performance was also evaluated separately for studied and unstudied items. Old items and new items looked separately. In terms of the old items, studied items, no difference was revealed between control and ADHD. No difference, no significant difference. However, the ADHD group identified a significant lower proportion for the old objects than the control group. Oh, new objects, sorry. So the ADHD group, significant lower proportion of unstudied item than the control group, indicating that ADHD group were worse than the control group on naming degraded items when unprimed. Yeah, so you show some new pictures they have never seen, and you ask them to name it. The ADHD group seems to be doing worse. This observed difference is baseline score presented a potential difficulty in relying on absolute priming. So that's a detail. I'm going to ignore the details. Yeah, because of this, this complication about the baseline differences, they calculated another score. They calculated relative priming score. That's this detail I'm going to ignore. The focus is on how you measure implicit and explicit memory. It seems that this paper is understandable and it demonstrates the difference between measurement of implicit memory and explicit memory. And you can read the rest of the paper as when you're writing the paper. That might be a keeper. This might be a keeper. Now I found one relevant article. This article explains the different ways you can measure implicit memory versus explicit memory. This will be one of the articles I will include in my writing assignment. And you can scroll down, look into the database, and find another one. Remember, I recommended another article, the article about exercising on implicit memory. This article also introduced some methodology about testing and measuring implicit memory. One of the measures they introduced is the word completion task, word stem completion task. It seems that many researchers use word completion task as a measure of implicit memory. For example, if you give people word stems and ask them to complete a word stem, KI, and there are different ways to complete this word. Implicit memory is measured by how people complete the word. If in the previous phase of the study, say the subjects saw words like a kiss in the study phase, they see kiss, and then in the testing or the retrieval phase, they are more likely to complete the word stem with kiss rather than kick, kiwi. This will show that they have some implicit memory retained from the study phase. That's another way to measure implicit memory. And then the exercising study also had another way of measuring implicit memory. That is recognizing some objects, or three-dimensional objects, as old or new. So between the two studies, I've learned about three different ways of measuring implicit memory. That will give me sufficient information to talk about the distinction between implicit and explicit memory. So those are the two studies I'm going to review. And now I'm going to take notes to write down the reference section. One study I'm going to review is this one. No. Where is it? Yeah, this is one of the articles I'm going to review. I'm going to write down take some notes. Reference section, one article I need to reference is this one. So let's see here. I need to note down the authors. Otherwise, see PA. Second author, Marconi. MCQ1E. How many answers? 3, right? Oh, 3 answers. HEUBCK. HE. First name BG. The publication year was 2004. The title, implicit and explicit memory performance in children with attention hyperdeficit, attention deficit. Hyperactivity disorder. And the journal, you fill in the journal titles. Yeah, I can do that later. And then the other article I'm going to review is this one. It's about Loprezi, LOPRNZI. 跑 Loprezi 跑地 Robin Gilbert. And oh no, there's 4 people. Robinson. I have to check APA style. Do I have a comma here? I'll check that later, the details. Dickerson, B. So how do I spell that? CK. What was your publication? Article details. Yeah, we do have a comma before the and sign. So here. Come here. Article information. It's 2019. Title is oh, I need to make sure the fonts are consistent. Use Time New Roman. Font, let's use font 12. And to check APA citation, I would really like to use this sample from Purdue University. See how do they cite information. Yeah, this would be a good example. Yeah, here's how you write the title of the article. Obviously, you don't capitalize all the letters, all the first letters. You capitalize the first letter of the first word in the title. Yeah, so is a period sign here? Let's check the sample. Yeah, there's a period sign here. I have to enlarge this one. Okay, and then I need to put in the journal information. British Journal of Developmental Psychology. Check with the sample. Yeah. Still have the document ID number. Mm. Yeah, and you do the same thing for this one. I'm not going to complete it. And then I need another citation from the textbook. The textbook is also part of your references. Yeah, you can get this reference. Oh no. Get rid of all the formatting. Should there be a comma or a period? It's a period. So it should be a. The hyperlinks are not required. It's okay you put in there, but you don't have to. So I'm going to get rid of it just to be consistent. And then I have to cite the textbook. So the textbook is also part of the information. The author, Sally Waters. Just get in there. How do I cite online textbooks, free textbooks? Anytime you are unsure about an APA style issue, you can search for it. This is from Dixie State University Library, so that's a good source. I Googled it. See here, APA ebook citation. You have an author's last name, first name, year of publication. Let's see, last name, first name. Waters Sally. What year was it published? No. Do I have it in the syllabus? Yeah, I have to search for the publication year, 2020. Yeah, let's see here. And the title. And it's published by I don't have a period here. Yeah, so now I have all my references ready. I know what paper I'm going to review. Next, I'm going to start writing. I will talk about writing in another video segment.